Turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. And we're going to be looking at the lesson. We've called it the bliss of the disciplined self. And we're in the Beatitudes, and this is the third of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. There are particular verse. One is a general either misunderstanding or non-understanding of what meek means, and we will look at what it includes. And then whether or not to take the phrase, they will inherit the earth, as a literal phrase or as more of a spiritual, metaphorical perspective. Is it literal or figurative? And we'll address those. So blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And as we look at the Hebrew background, we want to be aware, and this is interesting. The Greek Old Testament often will use different words to translate a Hebrew word. And when we begin looking at, for example, some of these concepts in the Beatitudes even, there are going to be words that are used by Jesus that have a rich Old Testament background and Jewish perspective to them. And so when we begin this lesson tonight, one of the things that we want to do is look at the rich Old Testament background to this particular word. Today, when we use the word meek, it is a word that has come down to us that almost sounds like when we say meek, we're saying something like weak, flabby, spineless, subservient to a fault, unable to stand up for yourself, letting people wipe their feet on you. I mean, think of all the expressions that can be used that may actually depict the idea of what it means to be meek in the minds of a lot of people. Some people actually would equate meekness with weakness. But that's far from the way the original word is used. In fact, several writers would say this, that, and this is so true of a lot of words, it is so deep and rich and wide in its meaning that it is hard to pick one English word to translate it. And that may be why, over the centuries, the word meek has translated the word praus, which that translates the Hebrew anav. And both Greek and Hebrew background, the word is very, very rich and diverse. It has this Greek and Hebrew background because it's going to look at it from two different directions. One of them looks at God. The other tends to look more toward men. One of them has to do mainly with the attitude, man's attitude toward God, and then the other deals with man's attitude toward his fellow man. So when we begin looking at this word, several times in the English translation, the word humble or lowly, sometimes in the Old Testament, even the word poor is used to translate this word meek. It is a favorite of the Psalms, and because it's found in the Psalms, here's what one person said, and I think they've really nailed it. And we're going to look at a couple places in the Old Testament where it's used to help give us the flavor of this I think, really wonderful definition. It describes loving and obedient humility that accepts the guidance of God and the providence of God. And It's for the person who never grows resentful and bitter about anything which life may bring. It's in the certainty that God's way is always best and that God is working in all things together so that His good will, so that His good may be brought about in our lives. And we're going to see some other words that I think describe that particular definition. So in the Psalms, this kind of person is very dear to God and stands in a special relationship to God. For example, if you have your Psalms with you, I want us to look at some critical insights about God and those who are meek or humble. The first is in Psalm 9, verse 12. For he who avenges blood remembers, he does not ignore the cry of the humble or the afflicted. God never forgets their cry. In chapter 10, verse 17, and of course this is the NIV rendering, you hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted, you encourage them and you listen to their cry. God scorns the scorners, but He gives grace to the lowly or the humble. And according to the book of Proverbs, it's better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. Jump over to Proverbs 3:34. I find it fascinating that in the wisdom literature, there's a lot to be said about the meek and the humble. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse, 34. God mocks the proud mockers, but He gives grace to the humble. And this is a theme that's picked up in the New Testament writers, that God gives grace to the humble. And if we think of meekness, humility, being surrender of self, willingness to obey God rather than self, an attitude of heart. In fact, as I was looking in Matthew 5 in this Bible, I don't know, I had set in a lecture somewhere, and I remember writing down the side of my Bible with all of the Beatitudes that these are crucial kingdom attitudes. So, blessed are the meek has to do with attitude toward God, toward others, toward life in general. Think how a meek attitude would be certainly canceled out by someone who would become bitter at life circumstances. Bill?
I think also you have to add yourself into this. Paul said, a person ought not to think more highly of himself than he ought to.
Oh, good, definitely. You're exactly right. Humility is toward self. It's how do I say this? And Paul would say this, you don't want to have, to be conceited. You don't want to have a higher view of yourself than you ought to think.
Or more.
And again, that's another issue. Well, it's neat you say that, because think about this. If we're claiming that being meek is not weak, then it definitely does bring in that whole line of thought, doesn't it?
I always thought of meek as being teachable, guidable.
It is. In fact, I was going to say that later tonight. Since you brought it up, I'll say that. There is this strong theme all through Scripture that deals with the humble that has to do with what's called the teachable spirit. You're exactly right. To be humble, to have a teachable spirit. Now, when I use that expression and I say to have a teachable spirit, what does that mean? What do you think that means? What does it sound like I'm saying if I say Joe has a teachable spirit? What am I saying? What am I saying about Joe? He has learned to listen. To be aware that there's so much that you don't know. And it is a humbling thing to come to a point in your life where you're very conscious and you're very much aware of how much you don't know. It's a humbling experience. But yes, just the whole idea of a teachable spirit. In fact, I read a thing the other day which made me almost want to say this. It may be that the attitude, blessed are the meek, that attitude of having the teachable spirit, being meek, may be one of the very basic core attitudes of kingdom living. And that what Jesus is after is this teachable spirit so that people could follow him. Yes?
I think Peter is a prime example of this. The night that Jesus was betrayed, he says, "No, Lord, it's not going to happen. I'll even die for you."
Good example.
And Jesus said, "Well, you're going to betray." "Oh, no, not me. I'll die for you." And he goes out, he weeps bitterly, but he preaches the first recorded gospel sermon.
Yes, he does.
Here's a man who learns from these terrible things that have happened in his life.
Mm-hmm. And connect that with, and this is what I've always connected that episode with. Think of how that embodies for us the core, really, of what the gospel is all about. What if God were only calling to him and to the kingdom people who were perfect? See, what if God only wanted apostles who never made any mistakes? What if God only wanted disciples who had it all together? Well, Peter, I think, embodies the good news of the gospel. On one hand, here you can just outright deny, and then it's not much later, God will choose Peter to actually proclaim the good news. And I think Peter is a very good example of humility. In fact, I love reading 1st and 2nd Peter because it's evident that you've got someone who has grown spiritually. And when he writes 1st and 2nd Peter, he could not have written that, from his own growth and his own experience spiritually. He couldn't have written that in some of the episodes that we read in the Gospels. He wasn't there yet. And yet, he was very teachable.
If you ever suppose that humility has no fire, you don't understand humility.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're going to come to some really good examples of that. The meek shall eat and be satisfied. Psalm 22:26. And then God guides the meek in justice and teaches them his way. And here again is just the emphasis on the meek being teachable, and God's going to teach his people justice. God rises in judgment to save the meek of the earth. And he lifts up the meek, but he casts down the wicked. He pleads the cause of the meek. He beautifies the meek with salvation, and the meek shall increase their joy in the Lord. Boy, there's so many passages on this. Let me just look at just a few of these. And again, this is all in the wisdom literature. Psalm 25:9. It was hard tonight just to try and figure out which ones to go to because there's so many good ones. Psalm 25:9. Actually, let's begin with verse 8. Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in his ways. He guides the humble in what is right, and he teaches them in his way. God is a God who is good and upright. And because God is good and upright, He didn't leave us guessing as to what kind of life we need to live, because He instructs us in His ways, but He guides the humble in what is right, and He teaches them His way. So here we have a reference again to the meek being very teachable, open to God's guidance and God's teaching. Let's see. Psalm 76:9 would be another one. When you, O God, rose up to judge, to save all the meek of the land, surely your wrath against men brings you praise, and survivors of your wrath are restrained. And so here, God is coming to the aid of those who are meek because they're being oppressed by the wicked. And that's actually a theme all through the Old Testament. It may well be that the arrogant men will oppress the weak, and we find a prophetic passage like Amos 2 and verse 7. But it is God's promise that the meek will inherit the earth. And we're going to come back and look at that quote from Psalm 37 and the context in which Jesus takes it. Yeah. Humble, yeah. In the English translation.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's any, I haven't seen any strong guideline as to when they decide which one to use. Whether, humble or meek. Different translations choose between those two. What's that? Well, we do. We do. No. In fact, one of the things I was going to mention is that passage. Well, that's okay. Where in the Old Testament, we find the comment, Moses was the meekest person on the face of the earth. I've heard, and you've probably even thought this too. People have said, well, Moses probably didn't write that statement, otherwise he wouldn't have been meek anymore. But that statement is fascinating because it's almost as if the narrator, in describing Moses, think of all the words that he could have chosen. He chose the Hebrew word and the Greek word, the anav or the praus, to describe Moses being the meekest man on the face of the earth. Now, let's look for a moment and kind of keep before us Moses as our case study, as it were. Think about what the Old Testament writer is trying to say about Moses. Certainly, he's not saying Moses was a weak man. I mean, if you think of Moses, in fact, it's his bold brashness and his impatience and irritation and just his strong character that gets him in trouble. Okay? And so we know the end of that story, why he doesn't get to go into the promised land. So when the writer says that he's the meekest person on the face of the earth, he's certainly not talking about, a milquetoast, mealy mouth person who could not stand up and speak, or any other things that individuals might connect with that. And the reason I'm holding off on this because I wanted to get to this word. Let's go ahead and use it because it's so important, because it's going to be a core concept of meek. It is really the idea, and think of how being teachable goes into this, but it's the notion of strength under control. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about how the Greeks like to talk about it. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics talks about it. There are other writers that like to talk about being meek, and they use illustrations for what that word's supposed to mean. And it gives you a wonderful insight into what it really means, and it makes you wonder, wow, couldn't we have a better English word? Because meek almost makes us miss the whole point. Okay, let's look at this word then. Because it has to do with strength being under control, some of the famous Greek philosophers would talk about the domestication of animals, the training of animals. One illustration that I read was interesting, and we certainly could identify with this. Think of having a German Shepherd as a family watchdog. You have domesticated the animal. He's tame. In one moment, he's in the backyard rolling around with the children. But in the next moment, he's in the front yard tearing the leg off a stranger. Okay? So when that German Shepherd is in the backyard rolling around with the children, it definitely is strength under control. And that's the dynamic of being meek. Now here's why this is so cool with the Beatitudes and how this fits into the Sermon on the Mount. Have you ever discovered in the Sermon on the Mount that so much of what Jesus says runs counter to what human nature wants to do? Have you noticed that in the Sermon on the Mount? So much of it runs counter. For example, what are you supposed to do if someone strikes you on the cheek? What does Jesus say? Turn the other one. Is that what we naturally want to do? No. Yeah. He does use a lot of exaggeration, hyperbole in the Sermon on the Mount to make some very strong points. And the one point and one of the many points that just runs straight through the Sermon on the Mount is to be a disciple of Jesus is going to go against many of the natural tendencies of human nature. Being a disciple of Jesus challenges the very basic fundamental approach to life that I'm going to do whatever I feel like doing. No, not the disciple. And so this idea of an attitude of being meek is very appropriate, even in the Beatitudes, because it's an attitude that doesn't allow self to just go unchecked. You may know individuals, you may even think about a time in your life where this described a portion of your own life, where you went through a time where you pretty well did what you thought you wanted to do, and you didn't want anybody telling you to do otherwise. When you live an unrestrained, uncontrolled life, what's the end of that? Where does that end up? It's never a pretty picture, is it? And so in the Sermon on the Mount and here in the Beatitudes, Jesus is going to get at some basic attitudes that run counter to just people living any way that they want to. Yeah, Bill?
There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end there is death.
Yes, and I would say that, you know what's probably underneath that is the idea that you really need to stop long enough to reflect on the decisions you're making and how you're choosing to live.
Every problem that man has comes from when he thinks he's smarter than God.
Oh. Yeah. Think of how that would completely negate any concept of a teachable spirit, obviously. If I think I'm smarter than God, I'm in big trouble. Okay. So here's an illustration of that. Another one is the illustration of a horse that's been broken in, and that same horse is obedient to the reins in the hands of the rider. You've got the bridle and the bit and the reins, and we know what it means for a horse to be broken. And here's what's interesting. I've watched enough movies about horses and breaking horses, and you're aware of this too. In your attempt to break a horse, the number one thing that a trainer doesn't want to do is to break its spirit. Because in your attempt to break a horse in so you can ride him, you can break his spirit. Here's what's interesting. God wants us to be broken in the sense that we come to Him with self being crucified, using Paul's language. But God doesn't want to break our spirit. And it's interesting in this beatitude that the whole attitude of meekness is the willingness of my spirit to be guided by God and Christ and the Spirit. And at the same time, God works on me on such a way He doesn't break my spirit. And that's really neat. But this is another illustration of the background to that which is meek and humble. Another, in the ancient world, it would refer to sheepdog being trained to obey the vocal commands of the shepherd. So here's a dog that's been worked with, and they've been trained. The dog is strong, but he's also submissive. That dog has a teachable spirit, so he's allowed himself to be trained so that the shepherd can use him how he needs to. And so fundamentally, it describes that which is under God's control. If my attitude and spirit is meek, then it's under God's control of the Spirit. And it doesn't mean that this is interesting, it doesn't mean that your strength of character and your ego strength is just wiped away like you'd wipe something off of a whiteboard. But it does mean, knowing how God has made me, strength of my own character, I still am under control, under God's control, not my own control. This is why, I'll be careful how I say this, because there's a lot of good stuff out there when you go to the store or you go online, a lot of good material that's in the self-help sections, and I'm aware of that. But too much of it is humanistically based, so that it leaves the impression, if I have just enough of my own strength, I can lift myself up by my own bootstraps and I can make it. And if I can make it, then you can. And if we all can make it, then we shouldn't have any problems. Well, it dismisses the fact that I'm not made in my own image. I'm made in God's image. And if I have problems, and if I'm the source of my own problems, I can't be my own answer. God provides the answer to what I'm struggling with. And the
possibility of lifting yourself by your own bootstraps. That's impossible.
And I think that's probably why the image has been utilized through the years. It's pretty common to hear people say that.
A pattern here that suggests that a meek or humble person is willing to be taught and follow a purpose greater than themselves, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yes.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
The person who is meek recognizes when they've signed on as a disciple of Jesus that they're part of a bigger story now. They're part of God's bigger plan unfolding in this world. Maybe this is a good example too. Recently, I was talking with an individual who admitted that in their work setting, they were not a good team player. They knew that. And they said, I'm sort of surprised that my boss hasn't fired me, but I know I'm not a good team player. It would seem to me that this word meek, in a practical level, implies being a good team player, that I know it's not about me. I'm part of a bigger picture, and in order for me to be part of that, I have to submit myself obediently to God's working and not just be my own person, do my own thing.
Much worked alone, with God's help, of course.
Yeah.
But he had to kind of be pushed into having assistance.
Well, he did.
He didn't want to do that.
Yeah, and I always wondered, sometimes leaders, and I've often wondered if this is the case with Moses, sometimes leaders may feel like there's no one around them qualified to do the job well enough. And as a reason for that, they're very uneasy to reach out. But there's a lot of good examples in Scripture about this whole idea. Aristotle, as you know, if you've read a little bit about him, always talked about the golden mean. And he saw being meek and humble as between two polar opposites and extremes. That on the one hand, you've got anger. On the other hand, you've got apathy. And think about how extreme those are. And he says that being humble is between the two. And that's the way he tried to describe it, which is fascinating to me. It means that you obviously are not going to be uncaring toward others. You're going to have some feeling, but you're not going to always be this person walking around in anger, taking out on other people. If you are meek, you are also, in fact, it's fascinating in James. Remember where he talks about heavenly wisdom? And he's going to use the expression there, gentleness of wisdom or meekness of wisdom. It's a neat little expression there in James. And the reason he uses it is because he wants his readers to understand that this whole attitude of meekness with a life under control means I'm going to exhibit a kind of gentle wisdom that cares about how I come off to others and treat other people. And Aristotle grappled with that. He realized on the one hand, you can be too emotional and just kind of, let your life spill over on others in negative ways. And then there were philosophers in his day and time, Stoics and others, who said, well, the best way to live is just get to the point where you don't feel anything, total non-emotional. So the more apathetic you were, the better life you were living. Well, I don't think so. And so this idea of being meek falls in between both of those. He would say it's neither too hasty nor too slow-tempered, was the way that he put it. But it is the virtue of the man who acts with gentleness, and it's associated with strength under control. Now, with the attitude of meek, we're talking about attitude toward God and man. Job twice talks about being meek toward God. Mary has an attitude of meekness. Lord, let it be unto you as your faithful maidservant. And it's interesting too, because in Acts 9 and verse 6, actually turn there before we turn to Psalm 37, because I want to talk about this one. Acts 9 and verse 6. This, of course, is the narrative for Saul's conversion. Let's see. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Verse 5, who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Now get up and go into the city and you'll be told what you must do. So he comes to a point where all resistance in his life is broken down. He obviously is teachable at this point. And because of his humility and his willingness to learn, God uses him as the apostle for the Gentiles. And at this point, all that Paul knows as Saul is that the Lord is speaking to him and things need to change, and he's willing to do that. Let's see. Let's look at Psalm 37, verse 11, because I want to mention a couple things that are crucial here. In Matthew 5, verse 5, when Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," he is appropriating Psalm 37, verse 11, where it says, "But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace." Or the NAV says, "enjoy great peace." Notice the word "but" in verse 11. That lets you know that it's in a context here in chapter 37 of Psalm, that we want to fit it in its context. And I'm amazed at how the context of Psalm 37 really fleshes out for us this bigger idea of what it means to be meek. You start off the psalm, "Do not fret because of evil men, or be envious of those who do wrong." See, if you have a meek and gentle attitude and heart and way of life, if your life is under the control of God, you're being obedient to God. There are a couple times in the Psalms where David kind of forgets that. And he says, "When I looked around and I saw how well off the wicked were doing," he says, "my feet almost slipped. But then I went to the sanctuary, then I saw their end and how they were going to end up." But here, don't fret because of evil men. So the one who is meek is going to be able to understand that the life that is worth living is the one for God, not what evil men are doing. Because he says, "For like grass they will soon wither, like green plants they will soon die away." Look in verse 3, "Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture." Notice the parallel thoughts here in verse 3 with verse 11. You've got dwelling in the land, almost sounds like inheriting the land, and to enjoy great peace almost sounds like enjoy safe pasture. So for Jesus' Jewish audience, they were very much aware of dwelling in the land and inheriting the land and letting it be a blessing from God. And think about Jewish Christians who would have heard read or read themselves this story of Jesus from Matthew. And as Jesus is speaking the Beatitudes, they would have immediately hooked into the idea of blessings coming from God because of the right attitudes. Verse 4, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart." There is a way in which God's people have always found that to be true. That when you make your heart's main desire to delight in the Lord, to let that be your greatest joy, to follow His will, it is amazing how God responds to that kind of life. And He'll give you the desires of your heart. And that may be another way of saying they'll inherit the land and they'll enjoy safe pasture. Look at verse 5 of Psalm 37. "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do this." So meekness has to do with commitment, has to do with trusting. It's just this basic fundamental attitude that is so crucial to our relationship with God. Verse 7 of Psalm 37, Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when men succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. In verse 8, refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it only leads to evil. See, it's interesting if you think about the heart that is meek and gentle and under control, under God's control, not living for self, you're not going to fret all the time. It is easy to get into a fretful attitude. When things are not working the way you'd like for them to get, twice in my lifetime, some of my best tools in my workshop I destroyed because I got so fretful and frustrated I threw them. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's ever done that. But sometimes you get shocked at how you let being fretful take over your whole attitude. And it can happen quickly before you know it. He says in verse 10, then a little while, and the wicked will be no more. Though you look for them, they'll not be found. But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy great peace. It's a wonderful movement through this psalm to describe God's relationship with the meek and the blessings that they'll receive because of that attitude. So, as we wind down pulling it all together, think about peace, inner peace, peace toward self, toward others, toward God, with those that are meek. Think of power, and here's how we need to look at it. The individual who is meek does have power, but it's power under control, so much so that your power actually is your influence. You don't have to carry around a big stick and beat people over the head and make things happen. Your power is your influence. And I would say that that is fundamentally what Jesus is looking for in his disciples. That I live the kind of life that's at its core has this attitude of being meek, gentle, forbearing, and that the power that comes out of that kind of life is one of influence. That people see that how I live, or maybe I could say it this way, that what I believe about Jesus and I allow him to do in my life, they're going to see it in my behavior, in my attitudes, and how I relate to others. And then, of course, this idea of control and self-discipline is just so crucial to this particular attitude, and then of gentleness. Let me end with this quote. I thought it was interesting. One individual said, well, when you kind of pull it all together, here's what it probably needs to sound like. Oh, the bliss of the man who has so committed himself to God that he is entirely God-controlled. For such a man will be right with God, he'll be right with self, and he'll be right with men and others. And he will enter into that life which God has promised and which God alone can give. Oh, the bliss of the man that's entirely God-controlled. And that's what meekness is all about. Being teachable, strength under control, self under control, being gentle, wise. It's a pretty neat word, really. It's hard for us with our sort of training over the years of what we thought it sounded like. It's hard for us to really get our hands around it, but it has a rich Old Testament background and certainly means a lot for disciples who are following Jesus, and to be listed as one of the characteristics of heavenly wisdom in the early church by James. A very much prized virtue in how we're to live before God and others. Let's end with a word of prayer. Almighty God, we come to you tonight so grateful for this opportunity that we can continue reflecting on the Beatitudes. And this particular Beatitude, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We realize, O God, that it's only with the strength of your Spirit living in us, that we can live under that kind of control. Because all of us can think about and remember times in our life where we wanted to live under our own control, and it just did not end up a pretty picture. Thank you for the power of the cross. Thank you for the power of our resurrected Lord, who can help us to live this life that is meek. And to inherit the earth means to be blessed in all the ways that you can bless us, deeply and richly, knowing that you provide, knowing that it's moving away from physical possession, but spiritual richness of being in covenant relationship with you, experiencing your love and the gift of your Spirit. Lord, help us. May we all feel the blessing of being meek. It's in the name of Jesus Christ that we pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here tonight.